This is Tyler McPeak, and in this video we'll be discussing the two terms, languages and dialects, and specifically what is the difference from a linguistic or language science point of view between these two terms that frequently pop up in any discussion about language. Let's start by considering what a layperson means by language and dialect when they use these terms in everyday conversation. There are several points of judgment criteria that a person might be considering when they use the terms language and dialect. The first would be the idea that a language is bigger than a dialect. This could mean that, geographically speaking, a language is spoken over a larger area than a dialect. The second would be that more people speak a language than a dialect. So in terms of population of native or even second language speakers, the language is spoken by a larger population of people than the quote-unquote dialect. Another idea is that a language is the standard form of a given language, quote-unquote, and that a dialect is a non-standard form. Similarly, a language may be regarded to be the correct form of given speech, and while the dialect is somehow inferior or less correct from a prescriptive point of view. Also, dialects are often regarded to have mutual intelligibility. So if you're wondering whether something is a dialect or a separate language, a common criteria used to distinguish between those would be that the dialects will have mutual intelligibility. Therefore, if one person can understand another, they must be speaking dialects of the same language. While if one person does not understand the other person, even if scientific similarity is shared between the two or common nationality, they must be speaking different languages. Another is that dialects are regional, while languages are spread across a greater region or sort of a governmental standard, but dialects are confined to particular regions and therefore are dialects. Lastly, dialects are often considered to be subsets of a language. So, somewhat similar to the first idea, a language contains many dialects. So when you talk about lots of dialects together, you're talking about a language. When you talk about particular ways of speaking, you're talking about a dialect within that language. Of course, when one considers case studies, all of these criteria can be regarded to be somewhat lacking in their scientific correctness, as people frequently handpick one or the other as it suits the needs of the particular speaker of defining a language and a dialect, but what is sometimes true of one is not true of the other, and vice versa. So we would ask, can there be a commonly agreed upon criteria for distinguishing between a language and a dialect, or are these terms non-scientific and therefore not of particular use to the linguist? It's a good question, but if we do consider that languages and dialects are of use to the linguist, we would likely have to consider it to be a political distinction. So, Max Weinrich had a famous quote that is often quoted in introductory linguistics classes, especially those dealing with dialectology, sociolinguistics, and historical linguistics. The quote is, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." What does this mean? It means that every language, quote-unquote, is in fact a dialect. It's just that the language that we're speaking of, or the particular dialect that we're talking about, has the backing of political or economic power, nation-state power, or quite literally an army and a navy, and therefore can be considered a language and not a dialect. In fact, it would be fair to say that the only difference between the terms language and dialect is a political difference. We can consider some case studies to reinforce this point. Swedish and Norwegian would be considered by nearly everyone to be two separate languages. However, in fact, they are totally mutually intelligible. There is a dialect continuum at the border but there is a dialect continuum at many random places if you drew a line, which is to say that the further away from the border you get, or any other arbitrary line that you draw within one of the country's borders, and you move away, people may start to speak differently. However, they are mutually intelligible unless you move very far away from that border. So though Swedish and Norwegian are essentially the same language, or by any of the other criteria, would be regarded to be mutually intelligible and therefore dialects of the same language, we consider them to be separate languages because, as Max Weinrich pointed out, Sweden and Norway both have their own armies and navies and have therefore declared themselves to have separate languages. Likewise, but perhaps somewhat more controversially, Urdu and Hindi were essentially a common language that were separated by nation-state borders due to factors of religion and otherwise at the time of the exit of the British, Urdu being declared to be a language of Pakistan and Hindi to be a language of India. Despite there not being a true scientific or a linguistic criteria for declaring these to be separate languages, again, due to political reasons, sensitivities involving religion and nation-state autonomy, Urdu and Hindi were declared to be separate languages and have remained so. This can sometimes result in a self-fulfilling prophecy over time in that a national border being a real physical boundary that is often protected by military, etc., there can be more and more of a difference resulting in what were originally the same language on either side of the border due to that barrier over time, reinforcing the original somewhat arbitrary and political distinction that was made between the two dialects. An opposite example from the previous two would be Chinese and its quote-unquote dialects. Mandarin Chinese is the lingua franca and dominant language of government of mainland China and of Taiwan, and in this case, China has frequently, due to their one China policy, declared that all of the languages of China essentially are dialects, quote-unquote, of Chinese, despite the fact that many of these quote-unquote dialects share very little typologically in common with Mandarin Chinese. Generally, they are not mutually intelligible. They often have a completely different syntax and linguistic structure to their language, sound structure, etc. Cantonese, for example, has 7 tones, while Chinese has only 4 tones and 1 neutral. So sound-wise, they are very different. They are totally unintelligible to each other, despite that they share a common writing system. However, let's remember that many languages of little relation to each other also share the Roman alphabet that English uses. And the borrowing of a writing system is not a judgment on the similarity of the two languages that use it.
Parisian French, what we now consider to be the standard French, provides another interesting example. In the case of Parisian French, it was somewhat arbitrarily designated and historically became the standard French, due primarily to it being the dialect spoken by a particular monarch of France. There would have otherwise been no reason for Parisian French in particular to rise above other dialects of French to become what we now regard to be the standard. This is somewhat similar to the Midland dialect of American English coming to be what we typically hear on news broadcasts, etc., and from some of our prominent politicians, despite the fact that there are many dialects of American English. In the case of Spanish and Portuguese, this is another example of two languages with high mutual intelligibility. Portuguese speakers, such as those in Brazil, tend to understand Spanish better than Spanish can understand spoken Portuguese, such as in Latin America, where Brazil borders many Spanish-speaking countries. However, the difference between the two is actually very slight. One of the main differences is that Portuguese has nasalized vowels to replace the otherwise nasal consonant that is realized in Spanish, such as a word like hermano. Hermano meaning brother in Spanish is hermano in Portuguese, the vowels in the end of the Armaio word in Portuguese are nasalized to take the place of the otherwise realized nasalized consonant of n, written as n, in IPA for Spanish. Similarly, there are other studies that have shown that Spanish speakers can read Portuguese with a 90% or higher comprehension rate. This would normally be regarded by most people as evidence that these are dialects of the same language and not separate languages. However, there would be a severe emotional response for many people to consider Spanish and Portuguese to be dialects of the same language rather than separate languages in their own right. However, in fact, there would be many linguists who regard all of the Romance and Latin languages, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, etc., to be dialects of Latin, and none of them being languages, quote-unquote, in their own right. Thanks for listening. This has been Tyler McPeak for the Florida Linguistics Association. Please visit us for more great linguistics content at www.floridalinguistics.com.